Thank you so much for inviting me out. And specifically to the Tierra Firme Policy Center, Blanca, Marco, and Patricia, thank you so much for your hospitality. And also want to just give shout outs to my folks who have come to see the talk today. Maya, my partner, she's a wonderful artist. I'm very happy to spend the morning with in the Bancroft. Juana Maria, who of course has always been a very important part of my vision of what's possible in academia, and Laura Perez, who has been there from the beginning. So thank you all for being here. I'm so happy to be able to share this work with you. So I want to take this opportunity to share a project I've been working with sort of on the side for a while, because it pushes at the limits of my understandings of both history and quantum physics, subjects in which I am not deeply trained. Although I did get some great training in history here, actually when I was a graduate student on the other side of the bay. So this particular project represents my search for a way to account for the multiple and overlapping forms of power that shape our experience as racialized and gendered subjects in the Americas. It represents my work to ground the questions of citizenship, recognition, participation, and belonging that have emerged in the work I've done in Venezuela and with the organization ELA para Translatinas, which I co-founded in San Francisco in 2006. The second book I'm working on, currently called Translatina Citizenship, although I still don't like that title, but so far that's the working title, documents the emergence of ELA and brings Translatina politics into conversation about political philosophy, citizenship, and immigration. I'm happy to talk more about the work I've done at ELA and the connection to this historical work during the question and answer period. Although my current book project focuses on transgender Latina or trans-Latina citizenship, I found that in order to account for the forms of power we encounter in trans-Latina lives, I needed to engage with the concept of the coloniality of power articulated by Aníbal Quijano and Maria Lugones. Seems to have fallen asleep. Oh, here we are. Oh, that's not where I want to go. So the depth of reaction that trans Latinas and transgender women in Latin America receive to their very presence cannot be accounted for with an arithmetic notion of power, one that understands power as accumulating on one side or the other, adding up to oppression. A simple arithmetic doesn't make sense when we look at the forms of rejection and exclusion, the overkill that visits the bodies of trans Latinas. So I followed Evelyn Hammonds in seeking a different geometry. Hammonds, in her landmark 1994 essay, Black Holes in the Geometry of Black Female Sexuality, proposes that a different set of methods are necessary to explore the contours of Black women's sexuality in the historical context of the silences that have marked it. Too often we use the metaphors of science in uninformed or uncritical ways, and Hammonds, as an astrophysicist, is able to kind of engage these metaphors more productively, I think, in that landmark essay. The clearest example of this for me is our use of the term resistance to describe responses to oppressive regimes of power. In our imaginary of power, it's easy to reduce this to the resistance of mechanics, the actions of one physical body on another, as in the idea of a boulder crushing a body and that body offering up some physical resistance to the mass of the boulder. This is a monolithic view of resistance, to be sure, literally, but it's also a notion of resistance that's not fully informed by the physical concept of resistance. Alternatively, we could model our understanding of resistance on the electrical sense of the term. Materials either conduct or resist the electricity that runs through them. Some materials are destroyed when a current runs through them. Others perform differently. They absorb, insulate, store, illuminate, or any other number of things. In this sense, our imaginary resistance can then include ways of diverting energy, insulating oneself so as not to get burned, connecting and disconnecting with the current in ways that interrupt it. Same metaphor, different imaginary. So although the concept of intersectionality has been incredibly productive for feminist critical race and queer theory because of its ability to describe systems of power and how they interconnect with each other, it's also suffered from a metaphorical reductionism that imagines discrete vectors of power intersecting at a particular point in space. And this is not really what Kimberly Crenshaw had in mind when she proposed it, this sort of use of a cumulative term where we compound race, gender, class, ability, sexuality, etc. into a single point weighted down, as it were, by these multiply intersecting vectors. The power of Trenchaw's intervention was, of course, to make it impossible to consider this point without considering all the vectors that have produced it. And yet this creates a linear notion of power and a vectorial imaginary interaction. Jasper Poor has critiqued this idea and proposed that instead we think of assemblages of power and resistance. But what if instead of lines we think of power as force fields whose ripples might interact or interact, as Karen Barad puts it, in nonlinear ways? Barad discusses the notion of diffraction patterns at length in Meeting the Universe Halfway, waves that interrupt each other and create troughs and peaks of energy in complex patterns. And all you have to do is look at the bay to see a diffraction pattern, right? All the waves kind of coming up, they are working along patterns of fields of contact with the shore, waves, that are coming out from boats, and they are interacting and interacting in very complex patterns. What other models might we come up with if we're to more rigorously interrogate the scientific and mathematical concepts that inform our conventional metaphors for understanding power? So Evelyn Hammonds is inspired by Michelle Wallace to propose the black hole as one metaphor for understanding the silence that surrounds the possibilities of engaging in an inquiry about black female sexuality. Though, let me go again. Though she doesn't fully engage the physics of black holes, her provocations have been deeply informative to my thinking about working through silent and deadly systems of power in which we're all embedded. This project, which I'm calling Los Huecos Negros, Cannibalism, Sodomy, and the Failure of Modernity in Tierra Firme, seeks to articulate the continuities between contemporary queer trans life worlds in Caracas and other parts of Latin America, and colonial forms of governmentality that reverberate in the extended present. To do this, I found myself looking at ways of describing sexual alterity in early contact manuscripts of Spanish empire building from 1516 to 1601, and trying to figure out a way to connect what I find there with the collaborative artistic and ethnographic work in Caracas and San Francisco. It begins in a hueco negro, a black hole. I find myself staring dazed into fluorescence at the corner of Avenida Baral con Lecuna in the center of Caracas. I have escaped the prissy gay bar where my friends have taken me. From the subterranean parking structure of a very fancy mall in Los Mercedes on the east side of Caracas, I have hopped in a cab with show flyer in hand. ¿Está cierta? Yes. We zoom onto the highway past the part of Caracas that mediates the well-to-do east side from a center represented by middle-class Caraqueños at the time as a space of impossibility, where one shouldn't venture after dark. I didn't really know this yet because I only had the location, no sense of its context. I was told there was a good drag show. The cab pulls up and I see the bristling cold of too many fluorescent tubes packed into one place, humming and flickering onto a gleaming yet still grungy tile floor and scattering off the food service fixtures. Are you sure this is the place? I asked the taxista. La Pilarica, Avenida Baral con Lecuna. It's here. I checked the flyer again and asked, is this La Pilarica? Of course, claro. A pilarica is the wooden implement you use to beat corn into arepa flour. Well, now you use pre-made flour, or if you really want to be old school about it, a shiny steel meat grinder. This is what they have at La Pilarica, which serves delicious arepas, corn cakes, toasted and stuffed with a number of ingredients, open all night. Over by the meat grinder, someone in the back notices me looking bewildered to find arepas where I was expecting a gay bar and waves me over. He's on a stool in front of a heavy black curtain I hadn't noticed until then. It's back here, he says. Es por aquí atrás. The curtain closes behind me and my eyes go dark from the bristling light's absence. I see there's another curtain before the light completely leaves the space I find myself in, but not the person tucked in the corner waiting to take my money. Eyes adjusting, I pay the admission and pass through the second curtain, where an entire two-level drag bar spreads out in front of me. A catwalk runs up the wall over the bar and along the length of the room. A tiny stage tucked on the side wall. It is in this bar where I see my first drag show in Venezuela, complete with Tina Turner and Whoopi Goldberg in a sister act supported by two very lecherous nuns. This is the bar of my friends who were dark-skinned. They weren't allowed through the doors of the prissy bar on the east side. And here in this bar, on this night, I realize if you are a black effeminate Venezuelan assigned male sex at birth who yearns to be recognized as a woman, What better way to make yourself legible than Tina, Whitney, Beyonce, even Whoopi? African-American femininity leverages visibility in a Venezuela that pretends to see no race and yet maintains its racial hierarchies through informal apartheid and a beauty culture that absolutely rejects blackness. This was the hangout of Rumi Quintero, the Venezuelan transgender activist who had invited me to the show. The East Side friends were horrified when they found out where I'd wandered. Not so much distaste for the bar as a concern for my safety and a genuine lack of knowledge that La Pilarita even existed. Uy, ese es un hueco negro, they exclaimed. I had entered a black hole in the bourgeois Caraqueño gay social world, but this is precisely the kind of place I was looking for. I'm trying to unify two quite distinct and temporally remote moments and places. The contemporary queer and trans life world of early 21st century Caracas, and the forms of radical alterity on which the 16th century Europeans based their notions of conquest. Both exist in a region formation I'm calling Tierra Firme. This is what the Europeans call this land, what we now know as the Caribbean coast of Panama, Colombia, Venezuela, sometimes also Guyana, Suriname, and the very north of Brazil. Before they claimed to know it, it was Tierra Firme, solid ground, unknown continent. This is a move towards a kind of queer regionalism following Gayatri Gopinath, a queer regionalism that follows the genealogy of regions as they've been constituted geopolitically and historically. Similar work has been done, of course, in the context of decolonial theory in the Americas, including the work of Walter Mignolo and Maria Lugones. While Mignolo and Lugones propose Andean and Nahua regional categories such as Tahuantinsuyo, Anahuac, Pachamama, and the Abya Yala of the isthmus we now call Panama and Colombia, as ways to reframe the region, I'm working with a colonial category of unknowing, Tierra Firme. In another moment, I might choose the early 19th century nation-building utopia, dystopia known as La Gran Colombia to talk about this place. My move to appropriate a regional category that fell out of use nearly half a millennium ago is invested not in recuperating the colonial project of defining and owning Tierra Firme, but rather marking the moment before colonizers could claim to know the land, the unknowability and unintelligibility of this land and its people. I want to stay in the Hueco Negro for a while, honoring the acculturation, deculturation, and transculturation that has occurred over centuries in this place. The European systems of knowledge production that define Tierra Firme as a vast unknown continue to delimit that which cannot be explained rationally into regions of unknowability or invisibility. However, as in the lands dubbed Tierra Firme and what later became the Americas, these zones of unintelligibility to European ways of knowing are quite alive with their own forms of meaning and life. The Huecos Negros of Caracas were a similar system as I encountered them in the course of my fieldwork. This essay attempts to honor the life within these spaces while accounting for the incredible forms of violence and diminished life chances that continue to affect life in the Huecos Negros. The depth of reaction that trans Latinas and transgender women in Latin America received to their very presence, as I said before, cannot be accounted for with an arithmetic notion of power, right? So I followed Evelyn Hammonds into the black hole to try to understand this a little bit more, because of this happened to be the Hueco Negro, which actually a black hole astronomically is an agujero negro in Spanish. So there's definitely a difference, but a Hueco Negro is a very particular thing in Caracas. So black holes have posed important epistemological questions to astronomers and physicists, and have become a fruitful metaphor for scholars asking questions about blackness, sexuality, and radical forms of alterity, such several other folks had written about it. Hammonds herself cautions that the metaphor might have its limits. After all, the black hole is a system that annihilates the terms on which it can be understood and observed. Its existence can be only inferred from its effects on the surrounding entities, but not directly observed. I'm struggling with the black hole of modernity in the Americas, which constantly pulls in everything within its dense gravitational sphere, only to rip it apart and absorb it. I want us to account for the unknowing, the erasing and consuming of lives, history, memory, landscapes, the continued pull of this force as we find ourselves at the event horizon, being stretched out infinitely while the matter that constitutes us slowly redshifts into absorption, appearing strangely frozen in time from outside the black hole. And if you want a great description of what it might be like in a black hole, I encourage you to read Neil deGrasse Tyson's Death by Black Hole. Maybe the answer is not to resist, but rather to find a way to tunnel through, or to harness the energy of the black hole, to slingshot ourselves through time and space in unpredictable and non-linear ways. The longer essay I'm excerpting here is my attempt to account for the gravitational pull of modernity and the violence it exacts on the bodies of people who don't fit what Lugones calls its categorical, dichotomous, hierarchical logic. Neil Whitehead calls this the cannibalist war machine. I don't have much time to develop the argument about cannibalism today, but what I propose is that cannibalism, sodomy, and idolatry are foundational pillars of alterity that legitimated the conquest and were used to create a particularly American form of governmentality in the project of colonialism. They represented fundamental differences in cultural systems, which were employed by Iberians as justification for violence and extraction of wealth. To understand the contemporary social formations, we need to ground our inquiry in this history. In particular, I'm trying to account for the excess violence that is visited on the bodies of transgender women in Latin America, informed by the work I've done with transformistas and Ella. While we all make our lives inside this murderous black hole of modernity, I found myself at a loss as to how to understand the ways that societies in the Americas treat these women, in particular, the deep forms of social exclusion that they negotiate, often creatively and successfully, sometimes not. Though much of my work focuses on transformista and transgender Latina survival, glamour, and style, I have chosen to address violence because these women must negotiate this violence. And you know, in the end, sometimes my approach lands as a little too celebratory of survival in a very murderous world. So I want to kind of balance it out a little bit. But I do think actually it's key to survival. To surviving a murderous system, to have that kind of style. So how do we bridge the temporal divide here? This is actually an image of from the third part of the America series by Theodore Debris, and this is of Tupinamba people in Brazil. I'll talk a little bit more about the Debris manuscript during Q&A if you have questions about it. But I'm trying to figure out how to kind of move through these fictions of European views of the Americas and move into our contemporary situation. How can we think of 1513 and 2016 in the same moment? I'm trying to propose time travel as a historical method, but I have not yet invented a machine to allow me to do this. Physicists who have helped me think about this have pointed out the difficulty in proposing time travel at all. There are three primary methods by which time travel might be possible. The first is using the black hole itself as a wormhole, the sort of Star Trek Next Generation version of time travel, to access other points in space-time. The second is using the gravity of the black hole to create the velocity necessary to exceed the speed of light and thus travel at a different rate, what's called the slingshot theory. And the third is quantum tunneling, which is probably the most realistic basis, in which subatomic particles appear instantaneously in another location without having expended the energy to arrive there, right? And they still can't figure out how that happens, so they just call it quantum tunneling. The larger essay is organized along these three methods. First, tunneling into the black hole itself. Then using the gravitational pull of the incident at Quarecua, which I'll discuss in a minute. And finally, considering a possible example of quantum tunneling. We'll jump from one Hueco Negro to another, finding ourselves in different places at different times. Today I'm going to discuss the 1513 incident depicted by Theodore Debris, in which Balboa threw 40 to 50 sodomites. Well, it happens here, in this area, Quarecua. You can see above Tumaco, there's a place named Huareca, which I think is pretty much around where Balboa would have been. So in which Balboa threw 40 to 50 sodomites to his dogs. Then I'm going to show you the work of Argelia Bravo and Jaira Falcón, who have collaborated to document this violence as it currently visits the bodies of transformistas in Venezuela. So to Tierra Firme it is then. As Vasco Núñez de Balboa and his party penetrated the land they knew as Tierra Firme in September of 1513, they left many bodies in their wake. Balboa had been seeking a passage to the Great Sea of the South, along the northern coast of South America and into the Darien, and had made contact with caciques on the Caribbean coast of what we know as the Isthmus of Panama today. The assembled party traveled from Careca inland to the territory of Quarecua, where the cacique of the same name, according to Peter Martyr, who wrote a 1516 account of the incident in the decades, received them in, quote, a haughty and hostile manner. A battle ensued, and Peter Martyr reported that 600 people, including the cacique, were slain like brute beasts. Peter Martyr's account details the ways Balboa's party dismembered and killed the occupants of Guarecua. In the wake of this massacre, a couple of days later, that Peter Martyr relates that Balboa discovers nefanda infecta venene among the people of the village of Guarecua and takes measures to deal with it. This is a very famous image that's been used by a number of theorists, including Jonathan Goldberg and Jackie Alexander. So I'll talk a little bit about how this image comes to exist. So nefanda infecta venene is nefarious sin, venereal sin, basically. And it's imagined to be transmissible, right? It's a venereal infection, which is essentially sodomy, as it was depicted in this particular engraving, which is from 1594. Jonathan Goldberg opens his article, Sodomy in the New World, Anthropologies of the New, with an account of this incident, which he calls an originary moment in the history of the making of America. Goldberg is not alone in his assessment of this incident, in which Balboa sets his dogs, aperrear is the word in Spanish to describe this act, right? There's actually a word for it, aperrear. On 40 to 50 people of Guarecua described as being dressed as women in Peter Martyr, or having committed the nefarious sin or pecado nefando. Only a few days before he reaches the summit of the mountains from which he first sees the great ocean of the south, which we now know as the Pacific Ocean. Eduardo Galeano writes a chilling account of this moment in Genesis, the first book of his Memory of Fire trilogy. It's actually where I first read the incident, and it wasn't until much later that I learned of the work of Jonathan Goldberg. In 1594, Theodore Debris published an emblematic image of this moment in America, Part 4, written by Geronimo Benzoni as part of Debris' Grand Voyages series, depicting the fierce dogs attacking and devouring several nearly naked and apparently male-bodied indigenous people in the lower field, while Balboa and his conquistadors, elaborately decorated and posed, look on from above. The dogs, led by Leoncico, son of Becerrillo, were imposing animals, which along with horses were important tools of conquest for the Spaniards. Francisco López de Gómara identifies the dogs as alanos, a muscular breed of hunting dog now known as the Spanish bulldog or alano español. In his brief mention of this incident, Gómara notes, Balboa set his dogs on 50 putos he found there and then burned them, first knowing of their abominable and filthy sin. So this is a usage of the word puto from 1553, incidentally. Naming both the new way of dealing with sodomites, the dogs, and the old, burning. It's important to note that dogs at the time were used as a tool of war, but not, as far as I can tell, as a tool or punishment in the Inquisition, which had been the primary way to deal with pecado nefando and sodomy on the peninsula, on Spanish soil. So what I'm arguing is that in this incident we see a different form of governmentality emerge, in which the tools of war, fueled by ecclesiastical sort of power, are appropriated by somebody who actually is a part of the royal power structure. And in fact, Balboa gets decapitated a few years later precisely because he doesn't fit into the system of order. So Goldberg cites Peter Martyr's 1516 account of the decades from a 1555 English translation by Richard Eden that is quite embellished. And another theorist, Michael Horswell, cites this translation as well. I'll just say that this is the part where I nerd out on different translations of Peter Martyr, so bear with me. Goldberg cites it, and actually I think both Goldberg and Horswell cite it because it's in sort of Shakespearean English, which makes it feel really old. It's an affective part of it, but it's actually not a great translation of the Latin. Balboa found the house of this king infected with the most abominable and unnatural lechery. For he found the king's brother and many other young men in women's apparel, smooth and effeminately decked, with which by the report of such dwelt above him, he abused with preposterous Venus. Of these, about the number of 40 he commanded be given for a prey to his dogs. Francis McNutt's 1912 translation of the decades recounts the event somewhat differently. Vasco discovered that the village of Guarecua was stained by the foulest vice. The king's brother and a number of other courtiers were dressed as women, and according to the accounts of the neighbors, shared the same passion. Vasco ordered 40 of them to be torn to pieces by the dogs. Interestingly, these English translations do not name sodomites or sodomy specifically, and neither does the Latin version of the Decades I was able to consult, published in 1533. But Galeano adds this term to his narrative. Goldberg argues that the description is one of sodomy through a turn of phrase in the Eden translation that replaces the shared the same passion in the McNutt translation with he abused with preposterous Venus, a phrase which stays with Goldberg throughout the entire essay. I don't have too much more time to go into the details, but I want to contest Goldberg's notion of sodomy on a few counts and propose an understanding of sodomy as viscerally implicated with cannibalism in the logic of conquest at this particular moment. First, it's important to note that the terms sodomy, sodomite, or sodomita, sodomia aren't operative in Peter Martyr's description. Instead, the notion of pollution is employed. The original Latin uses the construction nefanda infecta venede, where Goldberg recognizes this, but suggests that preposterous Venus, from the translation, remember, indicates the confusion that the Europeans see in these practices, although it was not an unfamiliar practice, I have to say, for Europeans either. Peter Martyr's contemporaries, royal historian Gonzalo Fernández de Oviedo y Valdés, 1535, and the less official historian cleric Francisco López de Gómara, 1552, do employ the category of sodomy and Gómara the term puto, as you recall, in the accounts they publish a few decades later. I want to suggest that a different logic than European confusion is operating in the attention paid by Europeans to the categories of sodomy and cannibalism. I want to mark this moment of deadly confusion as a kind of gut feeling of colonialism, the revulsion experienced by the conquistadores as they encounter radical alterity. I call this revolcado, a kind of existential upset that accompanies the threat of penetration and pollution. Second, this is an issue of translation. The genealogy of sodomy is different in the Spanish and English systems. Whereas in 1553, the translation of Peter Martyr focuses on vice and unnatural lechery and briefly mentions the cross-dressing practices on which it appears this evaluation was made, Spanish accounts more directly concern themselves with the question of category crisis, cross-dressing and gender embodiment. Gómara notes regarding the cacique's brother, no solamente en el traje, pero en todo salvo el parir era hembra. Not only in the clothing, but in everything except in giving birth was female. And here he actually uses the animal form of female, hembra, where in other parts of the chronicle he employs mujer. The key issue is the attention Gómara pays to the status of the transgressive body, occupying a gender category unrecognizable to the Spaniards. Goldberg's attention to the formation preposterous Venus in Eden's translation articulates this as a logic of backwardness and brings it back to sodomy in the Anglo imaginary as anal sex, which is clearly not what's happening in many of the contemporary accounts. This move erases the Spanish misapprehension of an indigenous gender system as a foundational site for this violence, focusing instead on the backside. Finally, Goldberg's argument separates the European evaluation of sodomy from its evaluation of cannibalism. I suggest that these two elements need to be understood together. Let's see, Michael Horsfeld does an excellent job of connecting the two discourses, but doesn't address the construction of cannibals with the level of detail he devotes to the sodomite. And of course, he points us to the work of Peter Hume, Rolena Adorno, and Charles Pouts, who have explored the idea of the cannibal and radical alterity in the Americas at length, especially in the Caribbean. Both Goldberg and Richard Trexler, point out the complicity of indigenous nobles with European systems of value in essentially trafficking in sodomites. This incident is one of those examples. Goldberg's approach to this is to ask why the cacique decides to hand over his brother and the other sodomites to Balboa. And in this move, I find a kind of exceptionalism about sodomy that works against Goldberg's own critique of the search for a transhistorical locus for the affirmation of alternative sexual practices. While Goldberg rightly points out the problems with that quest in anthropology and history, by separating the categories of sodomy and cannibalism, he splinters the possibility of thinking race and sex together, and reifies sodomy even as he critiques its reification. Similarly, Walter Mignolo focuses his decolonial project on the politics of knowledge in constructing Americanity, but ignores the embodied forms of knowledge and practice that exist in contemporary gender and sexuality formations. The challenge here is to find continuities where there are Huecos Negros, a task, well, I'll skip this part because I don't have time to go into Michael Horswell, what I'm trying to suggest is that we consider a logic of turning inside out, a lógica revolcada, to think about both sodomy and cannibalism in order to move more viscerally to connect these colonial acts to the contemporary trans life in the Americas. And this is how it's going to happen. The first thing you notice appears to be a lunar landscape stretching across a grid of white lines on a black background. With several details inset as well as a legend, we are looking at a map. Across the top, the map is titled Ubicación in situ erat corpus. Several aerial photographs and the details lead you to believe that the map is of a larger area where a specific site is marked in increasing detail. In detail 4, which is over here, we find the X that marks the spot. Lugar del suceso. Here's the code. The key to the map. Lugar del suceso, site of the event, in Parque Los Caobos. As you decode the details, the landscape becomes clearer. An aerial view of the metropolitan area, a murky map crisscrossed with points and lines, an anatomical drawing with a red circle on the right upper arm, pointing you to the larger landscape. It is a scar map, a blown-up detail of the scars on the upper arm of Jahaira Falcón, resulting from dog bites and rubber bullet wounds she received in an attack from a canine unit of the Metropolitan Police in Caracas while she walked through Parque Los Caobos, a well-known gay cruising spot. This is our star map, Arte Evidencia 3, Cartografía de una Historia Interminable. What looks like a lunar landscape at first is resolved as the pockmarked and scarred upper arm where arrows point to canine dental marks and rubber bullet wounds, according to the legend. It is a white-on-black print made by reversing the image which resulted from the Venezuelan feminist artist Argelia Bravo's fingerprinting of Jahaira's entire body to catalog her scars in a collaboration entitled Arte Evidencia, created from 2004 to 2009 in Caracas. The 11 by 17 inkjet print, as well as the entire exhibition, which showed in Caracas and Buenos Aires, is part of a long-standing collaboration between Argelia and Jahaira that stemmed from Argelia's involvement in HIV prevention outreach on Avenida Libertador, a zone where transgender women and transformistas in Caracas do sex work. Argelia and I worked together to found and support Transformistas de Venezuela, an organization focused on human rights for trans women, while I was in Caracas doing the fieldwork of my first book. Jahaira, a transformista who had experienced a great deal of violence in the street and from police, became an outspoken trans activist in Venezuela, decrying the impunity that subjected her to so much violence. She, like many transformistas in Venezuela, bears the marks of this violence and impunity on her body. In the 5-year collaboration, Argelia and Jahaira produced dermocopias, ink transfers from Jahaira's skin onto paper, glass, and fiber, to create an inventory of Jahaira's body. Through this work, Argelia and Jahaira used the redefined space of the art gallery to draw attention to human rights violations and to leverage the ways these spaces privilege the bodies inside them to provide some safety and visibility for Jahaira, who at the time was facing death threats from the police that she had denounced. After enduring this violence and death threats, Jahaira sought and was granted asylum in Buenos Aires and continues to live in Argentina and advocate for the lives of trans sex workers. So this art project actually resulted in her getting an asylum in Argentina. When they went to install it in the museum, she was granted access to Argentina and stayed. It is Jahaira's and Argelia's star map that connects the contemporary forms of gendered violence to the events at Huecos Negros 15-13. The black holes of the tooth marks in Jahaira's scar map reveal the, quote, history without end that Jahaira and other trans women in Latin America are living. To link the events in Hueco with Jahaira's own canine attack directly might serve as an argument for the historical continuity of violence against gender-variant individuals over the long course of European colonization in the Americas, but we don't need a direct line of similar acts to make this case. A nonlinear and unpredictable system is more capable of accounting for the multiple manifestations of these forms of colonial violence in the everyday. This is why we have to use time travel as a historical method. Colonial violence functions through a quantum logic, bewildering a Newtonian physics of force, with its dazzling displays of excess on sites and bodies, a toxic combination of the distribution of life chances and the space of death. Jahaira bears these black holes as marks in her negotiation of these forces. She and hers, relegated to los Huecos Negros of Venezuelan society, find ways to tunnel through, reach escape velocity, appear and disappear unpredictably. To fully account for this life is necessary to travel unpredictably through this extended present, a history without end. This brings me to the failure of modernity. I discuss this concept a great deal in my work on Venezuela. Modernity is a project at which Latin Americans are constantly failing, which constantly reinscribes itself on our bodies and landscapes. The anxiety of failing to be modern and the perverse delight that can often accompany this failure. If we think of cannibalism as a system of consumption of human bodies, we cannot overlook the European-descended practices of consumption of human bodies during the 16th century that created the forms of policing and control that we are subject to now. We cannot overlook the ritual forms of cannibalism inherent in Western traditions such as communion, or the consumption of bodies through labor, enslavement, forced relocation, deportation, feminicide, policing, incarceration, the death penalty. This is the true cannibalism, the consumption of human bodies to create the terms of modernity on which we all live our lives. Transgender women throughout the Americas are living with these techniques on a daily basis here and now. I believe that this is what has produced the murderous present, one in which over 15 trans women of color were murdered in the U.S. during 2015, during the first 15 weeks of 2015, and many more throughout the hemisphere. Trans women are not alone in this. The past 2 years have brought a heightened visibility to police killings of black people, leading to the development of the Black Lives Matter movement. Dreamers have infiltrated ICE detention centers to reveal the deplorable conditions in which we lock up undocumented immigrants. Trans women of color in the U.S. and transgender Latin American women have begun to finally be heard in protest. In my moments of hope, I think maybe we are at the beginning of the failure of modernity, where this cannibalistic system is no longer viable, and we have to find another way to live. I strive for the failure of modernity. Thank you.